Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. Over the course of this summer school series, College Before College, we've talked about acceleration from several different angles. We've explored how dual enrollment and early college programs moved from relatively specialized opportunities into the mainstream of American education. We've discussed the growing tendency to confuse accumulation with learning. We've examined the changing purpose of college itself, the rise of accountability systems and momentum metrics, and the ways that acceleration can either widen opportunity or reinforce inequality depending on how programs are designed. But there's one more piece to this conversation that I think increasingly sits beneath all of the others, and it's the one we don't discuss nearly enough in public. Who actually pays for college before college? Because eventually every major educational reform reaches the same point. At first, the conversation centers around aspiration. We talk about opportunity, innovation, and access. But over time, if the reform becomes permanent rather than experimental, another question inevitably emerges. How is this system actually supposed to sustain itself financially? And here in Arkansas, that question has become especially relevant over the past 2 years with the passage of the Access Act and the rapid expansion of concurrent credit expectations across the state. Now, to be clear, much of the access legislation reflects trends that are happening nationally. States increasingly want more students participating in accelerated coursework. Policymakers want smoother transitions between high school and college. Workforce leaders want faster credential attainment, families want lower college cost, and institutions are being encouraged to reduce barriers and create more seamless pathways. So in many ways, access simply formalizes where the education has already been heading. The law expands accelerated learning opportunities in public schools. It creates scholarship structures designed to support concurrent credit participation. It standardizes tuition frameworks surrounding concurrent enrollment, and underlying much of it is a very clear assumption. More students ought to begin college-level work earlier. Now, again, none of that is inherently problematic. In fact, throughout this series, I've repeatedly argued that expanded access to accelerated and advanced coursework can be profoundly beneficial for students, especially those from rural communities, lower income backgrounds, or schools with historically limited advanced offerings. But one of the things I've noticed in public conversations surrounding acceleration policy is that the discussion almost always centers on what families save. Free college credit, lower tuition, reduced debt, faster degrees, lower cost. And let's be clear, those are real and meaningful benefits. But what often receives far less attention is the reality that college itself still costs money to provide. The cost does not disappear simply because the tuition is discounted. Somewhere inside this conversation are institutions, particularly and regularly community colleges or two-year colleges, carrying much of the operational burden of making these programs work at scale. Now, that's one reason I found myself increasingly drawn to the recent research from the Community College Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. Their work examines the financial pressures dual enrollment expansion can place on colleges, especially two-year institutions that frequently serve as the primary engines of concurrent credit delivery. And what the research suggests is fairly sobering. In many states, community colleges receive significantly less revenue for dual enrollment students than they do for traditional students, even while maintaining many of the same underlying costs. The public often imagines concurrent credit as simply a high school class with a college label attached to it. But maintaining legitimate college coursework requires extensive infrastructure. There are accreditation requirements, faculty credentialing standards, curriculum oversight, learning management systems, transcript systems, transfer compliance, assessment processes, student support services, partnership coordination, advising, faculty development, quality assurance, and none of those things are free. And importantly, high-quality dual enrollment is not inexpensive dual enrollment. That may actually be one of the most important realities in this entire conversation. Because throughout the series, we've talked repeatedly about quality. We've discussed how acceleration should not simply be a race toward accumulation. We've emphasized the importance of advising, coherence, support structures, transferability, and meaningful learning systems. But all of those things require sustained institutional investment. You cannot simultaneously demand large-scale expansion, strong advising, rigorous quality control, equitable access, seamless transfer, workforce responsiveness, and measurable outcomes, while assuming colleges can infinitely absorb the financial strain in the background. Because at some point, sustainability matters. And honestly, I think community colleges occupy an especially difficult position inside this entire ecosystem. Increasingly, these institutions are being asked to do almost everything at once. They're expected to widen access, strengthen workforce development, support adult learners, improve credential attainment, maintain affordability, partner with K-12 systems, expand dual enrollment, respond to local economic needs, and do it while many are simultaneously navigating demographic decline, enrollment volatility, and ongoing funding pressures. That is an enormous amount of institutional responsibility. And one of the most revealing things about the recent Arkansas discourse surrounding concurrent credit is how quickly enrollment growth has accelerated. Concurrent enrollment participation has risen dramatically in recent years, which means colleges are increasingly serving large numbers of students who may be paying substantially reduced tuition rates compared to traditional college students. And again, from the family perspective, that often looks like a tremendous success story. But institutions experience the equation differently. If dual enrollment reimbursement structures fail to cover the actual cost of instruction and support, colleges eventually face difficult choices. They may cross-subsidize programs internally, they may rely more heavily on adjunct instruction, they may reduce support services or limit participation, or they may simply struggle financially while trying to meet expanded state expectations. And this is where I think the conversation becomes larger than Arkansas and the Access Act. Because nationally, we're watching acceleration move from innovation to infrastructure. And that's an important distinction. When dual enrollment was relatively small, institutions could often absorb inefficiencies because programs remained limited in scale. But once acceleration becomes a central pillar of statewide educational policy, sustainability can no longer depend primarily on institutional goodwill. The system itself has to work. And I think this represents the next major phase of the dual enrollment movement. The first generation of policy focused on access. Second generation focused on quality and outcomes. But the next generation may very well need to focus on sustainability. Not because the goals are wrong, but because systems that matter eventually require durable financial structures. One of the things that concerns me sometimes in educational policy conversations is how quickly we treat institutions as abstract delivery systems rather than communities of people attempting to carry out increasingly complicated missions. Colleges are not infinitely elastic. Faculty time is finite, advising capacity is finite, student support systems require staffing and investment, quality requires oversight, and transfer systems require coordination. And if we truly believe that acceleration matters, if we believe it strengthens opportunity, workforce readiness, affordability, and educational attainment, then we also have to be willing to build economic structures that sustain the institutions responsible for delivering it. Otherwise, and over time, quality erodes. That's especially important because the strongest acceleration systems are almost never the cheapest ones. The best programs tend to include robust advising, thoughtful pathways, strong faculty partnerships, clear transferability, and intentional student support. Those things create meaningful opportunity. They also cost money. I think there's a temptation sometimes in educational reform to assume that scale itself represents success. More students, more credits, more pathways, more participation. But educational systems eventually reveal why and what they truly value through what they're willing to sustain financially over long periods of time. And if we want college before college to remain meaningful rather than merely transactional, then sustainability has to become a part of the conversation too. Because ultimately this should not become a story where students win only because institutions quietly lose ground. The healthiest version of acceleration is one where students benefit, families benefit, employers, states, and institutions themselves remain strong enough to continue delivering high-quality educational experiences for the next generation of students who come after them. That is a much, much harder balance than simply promising cheaper credits. But it's also the balance that determines whether acceleration becomes a durable public good or simply another short-term policy enthusiasm that strains the very institutions being asked to carry it forward. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.